Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a Game Week 8 cheat sheet, and we're looking ahead towards finally the end of an international break that was rather dull, and hopefully some more Premier League football. And here we land at Game Week 8, where we have arguably a fixture swing that has already moved, because the Arsenal sort of plum fixtures are gone, the Bournemouth plum fixtures are gone. We're now headed into a sea of games which are a little bit more beneficial, definitely towards City in the short term, and then we will soon see another great Liverpool swing, I think, rear its head around Game Week 10. On top of that, Game Week 12 seems to be another sort of window, generally speaking, where there's a lot of swings for teams like Chelsea, even teams like Arsenal, once again, when their fixtures ease up. And that's sort of the landscape right now when it comes to fixtures. In terms of the cheat sheet series, if you've never watched it before, it's effectively a series where we look at all the positions and price points in FPL and try to tier them by order really of efficiency. And from right now, what I can say is we have more than enough data to sort of rely upon this season's data, but it still helps, of course, to have that sort of historic underlying basis from the prior years, and that helps us to inform and make better decisions as we look ahead and evaluate for fixtures. So it's nice, once again, that we've hit a sort of landmark where we can rely on and trust some of the data that we have, but we're still really, I would say, pretty far away from getting conclusive signs on teams, because ultimately you haven't played, or teams haven't played themselves more than once, or even once, and that actually has an impact on, once again, how we evaluate some of the results have gone so far based on fixture difficulty and things like that. Anyways, let's start with the midfielders. In the budget midfielder territory, we have Dibbling, who gets a rise. He is someone who has an amazing game here, Leicester at home, and part of why he gets a rise is there is still a bit of a difference in terms of spending that sort of money for someone like Dibbling compared to spending the sort of money that, you know, is the cost of a Mavididi. So I think that factors in very much towards this decision. I'm not saying that Dibbling is far and away better than all the likes of 5.x midfielders within the game. It's just that for that 4.5 price point, or 4.6 rather, he's actually supposed to be someone you compare to the other 4.5s, and because he's so clear. And really, the 3-4-3 structure is very viable in FPL right now. I do think that Dibbling is an extremely valuable asset, and that's sort of reflecting of that. And also, we've waited a few weeks to sort of see what his minutes would look like, and they've only really turned out to be better. He's been trusted even in big games, such as the Arsenal match, and I think that's a super promising sign when you're looking ahead towards a plum fixture here, where you can definitely look at playing someone like Dibbling. Rodgers still remains at the sort of top as well. He's someone who is clearly entering a sea of tougher fixtures, but as we can see, a lot of the players around these territories don't necessarily have the best minutes, and I think that has a factor in terms of where you evaluate the players. I might not necessarily recommend Rodgers as someone that you have to go for on a wild card, let's say if you were going for a Game Week 8 wild card, but at the same time, he's also someone who's still extremely strong as a pick, and I don't really think there's any issues with owning him for the time being. Whereas Adama is someone who actually rises and Carvalho drops. The Carvalho drop is simply due to minutes, right? The benching shows, even in spite of him actually scoring, ironically there. So I guess managers were rewarded anyways, but the general impact of him not starting every single game is quite consequential. The same way, for example, it affected Sade, who a lot of people were thinking, even myself included, that he could actually get a lot of minutes in a sort of post non-Wisa and also non-Igor world. And ultimately, when we look at, let's say, players like Mavididi, I still have that slight fear with someone like Steve Cooper and his minutes going forward. So that's why I haven't necessarily put Mavididi towards the top, whereas his fixtures are actually really, really good. Buonanotte is also here. I do think that some of these Leicester picks are a little bit overrated, in the sense that people will think that they're going to give very consistent returns. Ultimately, both of these players, I would say, aren't expected to deliver that much. Buonanotte has actually some good underlying stats to start the season, but he's also played arguably a lot less minutes. And Mavididi, we also know, could be someone who actually still has a bit of pen share when Vardy comes off the field, which happens now a little bit earlier than he comes off the field. So that's actually a bit of a plus for Mavididi. On top of, let's say, going back to Adama and sort of illustrating why I think he gets a rise, his minutes so far have been stellar. His underlying stats so far have been stellar. Even though the Fulham fixtures aren't amazing, I just think that right now I'm comfortable in saying that he's a very, very good pick. Even if someone was to sort of rate them in their heads as a green pick, I think that would be totally fine. He seems like a very, very strong pick, and Marcus Silva seems determined in actually utilizing him in the best way possible with the best minutes possible. So I do really like Adama for this season. As far as the next tier, the 5.5 plus, McNeil still stands at the top. Semenyo drops simply due to fixtures. I think it's very hard to actually play Semenyo on any of the next 3 fixtures. So whilst the swing was beautiful in game week 6 and 7, it's very much like some of the other Arsenal assets where you're less likely to play them over 8, 9, and 10. For Smith Rowe, it's also overcoming a fixture like Man City, even though his minutes have generally speaking been a little bit yo-yo-y, and he was actually benched from the Man City game. I think that was a very specific game state in the sense that that was, Fulham setting up for Man City. You probably weren't going to play Smith Rowe anyways. Do I think his minutes in the long term are going to be poor? I don't think so. I think for the games that you actually want to be playing Smith Rowe versus, then he's actually going to be a very valuable pick. And that's why he also gets a rise ultimately now that the fixtures, once again, of course, when you come off a City game, even though they actually played extremely well, like I have to give credit to the Fulham performance. That was probably the worst that I've seen City play defensively, and actually one of the better Fulham performances that I've seen this season, in spite of their really, really good start. And they didn't get any points there, but it just shows you the amount of quality of chances that they actually built, how strong that they've been all season long. Just have to give respect to a lot of their sort of attacking picks as well. As far as, let's say, the next tier at the 6.x's, Johnson gets a massive rise. His minutes have been perfect so far. We always knew that he had slightly better underlying stats than Kulusevski, and I always tried to draw the distinction of actually looking at how Johnson is someone who actually is very much XG dominant compared to someone who's XA dominant, and that has a huge implication on how those underlying stats translate to future FPL points. He's been electric so far. I believe he scored 7 out of 7 games in a row, which just shows you that a lot of people who owned Johnson at the tail end of last season probably thought he was a really poor finisher, and it shows you how quickly things change and how quickly our conceptions change, which is also why I think we should also practice a little bit of patience sometimes with valuable picks, particularly when they hit good fixture runs, even though you've been hurt by them before. And I think this really does apply to someone like Eze as well, who actually gets a rise despite not delivering much at all this season, given that his fixtures will be a little bit easier coming off of that Liverpool game. So Eze gets a slight rise, Johnson gets a massive rise, Kulusevski and Trossard I still rate around that tier. Trossard is probably someone that I would sell after the Bournemouth fixture, but if you got him in for the last 2-3 games, then it makes sense to still keep him for Bournemouth away, in my opinion. Martinelli also getting a sort of tendon injury, something that was actually mentioned over the international break. That's going to have a significant impact on ultimately the valuation of other Arsenal assets, right? Because someone like Sterling, someone like Trossard will probably have to cover in the gap in minutes, and that's actually a general boost towards someone like Trossard in the short term. As far as, let's say, Kulusevski, we know his minutes are very good, but do I still see him as someone that I would necessarily want to pick over Johnson? No, I've always said that I prefer Johnson to Kulusevski, and that's sort of the separation now that the Spurs fixtures are really, really primed. For Savinho, he gets a drop. I don't really know why, but Pep has sort of regressed back into this sort of structure of Bernardo on the right wing, bit of tempo, bit more control, I guess, and less aggression, futures attacking through like a direct attacking winger like Savinho is. Whatever the case may be, his minutes have clearly dropped in the short term. We've seen him play in some Champions League matches, but unfortunately, even though the fixtures are so good for City, I think it's very hard to trust the minutes for whatever reason. And unfortunately, his minutes drop, which means once again he drops on the cheat sheet. For Martinelli, it's the issue with the tendon thing. Arguably, he could be even off the cheat sheet, and he's probably a very good sell directly to Johnson this week. But for people who are holding on, potentially there could be some better news down the line. I'm not quite sure. I'm expecting that Martinelli might not play versus Bournemouth, which means he's not really valuable as an FPL asset in the short term. As far as the 7.x tier, moving on to that, Jota actually gets a pretty big fat welcome or re-welcoming to the cheat sheet. We really only took him off because the injury risks a couple of weeks ago, and we knew that his minutes would be a bit dicey. But Darwin actually has really struggled to get himself back into the team, and that's a huge indictment on Darwin's sort of squad status within Liverpool. On the other side, that's a huge plus towards someone like Diogo Jota, whereas someone like Luis Diaz, as we mentioned in the previous episode, was someone who was very much prone towards a benching for Cody Gakpo. And my genuine sentiment is that Gakpo is much better competition right now than what, let's say, Darwin brings to the table versus Jota. So because of that, Jota is much more valuable. He's also a central threat, something that I've always valued, particularly when it comes to anyone that's not Salah, for example, and I guess a post-Klopp Liverpool. But ultimately, yeah, Jota gets a big fat reintroduction. He seems fit for now. And I think even though the fixtures aren't perfect for Liverpool, he's still at a really nice price point, and still someone that I think I would consider going forwards, particularly when game week 10 rears its head around for Liverpool. As far as Gordon, the immediate fixture is actually quite good, but I don't really know what the status is of Alexander Isak. He might come back and maybe even start in game week 8, because we have seen a tendency for Newcastle to start players even if they're, let's say, not at peak fitness. It's very different to, I guess, the João Pedro situation and his reintegration a few weeks ago. So I do wonder whether Gordon will suffer from that. He also did most recently miss a penalty. Maybe there's a chance that Fabian Schär can take the next penalty, which obviously has another impact negatively on Gordon as the fixtures get a little bit worse for Newcastle. So that's why Gordon drops. As far as, let's say, Luis Diaz and Bruno, yeah, differentials for now, in my opinion. I still think that Luis Diaz is not necessarily a sell until we see the full ramifications of what happens with some of the international break things. It might be the case that based on what Slot said 4 weeks ago, that he was planning to always play Gakpo after the international break, something that happens very often, right, with Liverpool, where we see some of the players go out for South American international duty, they come back, they're a little bit more tired, they come off the bench. And I think it's very likely that could happen to Luis Diaz, which is why he still stays as a differential, even though it's a nice home game. Because Chelsea, if anything, as we've mentioned in the sort of what we've learned series, is definitely a team much more tilted towards attack than defense. So that's why we have the clear differentiation there. And so I do like Luis Diaz still, but he has to drop for now because I think the minutes in the short term are still very, very much shaky. And you could revisit someone like him in Game Week 10. Bruno, look, United have been really poor. His underlying stats haven't really suffered too much from let's say, a prior season. But clearly the output of United and the output of Bruno has been shocking. Do I think that they're suddenly very clearly a bottom 3 team or a bottom 3 offense because they've scored one of the least goals in the league? Not necessarily, no. But I can understand why people have a huge aversion towards Bruno, because the reality is you do want to see production and you do want to see end product. Do I expect that end product will come over a 3 to 5 fixture swing that I think is quite good for United, generally speaking? Yes. Do I think Erik ten Hag is still an awful coach? And have I held that sort of sentiment for the last 2 seasons? Yes. But so it really comes down to what you think United can produce over this run. Because ultimately, when you actually look at where they sit in terms of the table when it comes to underlying stats, they've actually been okay when it comes to offense. And I think considering that Bruno is a penalty taker still, I mean, he actually has some inherent value in the game. So he's always going to be on the cheat sheet for now. And we'll see if he rises, of course, after hopefully what is a good performance for Brentford. As far as Foden and Son, Foden has very clearly had a terrible start to the season. I wouldn't say that I can read into something being very clearly wrong with Foden, but Pep has intonated that himself. I can understand why people will have some questions about whether Foden really deserves to be a green pick. I still think the fixtures are so good and his minutes still look like that they should still be so good that I would have Foden high up on the cheat sheet here. But I can understand, as I said, a lot of people having, once again, similar thoughts to, I suppose, the approach to Bruno, where Foden has looked very poor, not just for Man City, but also, once again, I think a lot of people have already commented on sort of his, lack of ability with the English national team, but that doesn't really have any implications on Man City. For the most part, he's been amazing for them, and I'm not really worried about Foden's ability to do well over a good run of games where he can easily start to produce as he is, as an amazing finisher. So that's Foden. And with Son, it's really just a question about whether he is actually going to be fit for this West Ham at home game. I think he's actually a really good transfer from someone like Saka, who a lot of people are holding. But I can understand a lot of people seeing Saka producing so well, seeing him be so creative this season, and being reluctant to sort of move into that fixture swing of Son and rather holding that transfer. And the same applies to Palmer, who has tougher fixtures. So both Saka and Palmer, I think, are prone to being transfers out for Son, but I can understand people wanting to hold on to the likes of Saka, the likes of Son, etc., etc. So it really comes down to your own personal sentiment, in my opinion, as to what you want to do with these sorts of players. But there is clearly an opportunity, in my opinion, to move into that sort of one free transfer space to get to Son if you want to do so, and if you're prepared to do so. With Salah, I mentioned that last week. I felt like he deserved a drop because I don't think it's a huge captaincy option for the next 3 weeks, and that included last week. As I said, there's a bit of a Liverpool fixture swing on Game Week 10, and you might want to reconsider owning Salah then. I actually think that in the short term, maybe you could drop someone like Salah, and that could be something that works if you're prepared to go towards Haaland. If you're not, it's perfectly fine to see Salah still as a green pick. an amazing pick because you're still going to own him for the long term. So it really comes down to your own personal preference and thoughts on approaching a Salah and what the plan is really within the short term. Because I'm also, once again, indicating that this isn't really talking about the Haaland plus Salah draft structure, right? If you own Haaland plus Salah, it might be the case that you still prefer something like Salah to Son in the short term. And that's sort of argument that I made with Saka and Palmer still applies. So it comes down to your own personal sentiments on team structure and things like that, and how you value captaincies in the short term and how you plan to use your free transfers. But for now, Salah still remains the yellow pick. I'm sure he'll be green in 2 game weeks time. As far as forward picks, just moving over towards there, we have Jimenez getting a huge rise. As I said, Jimenez was definitely someone who has looked incredible so far. The fact that he's on penalties and Muniz isn't is very significant when it comes to evaluating Muniz for 75 minutes a game versus Jimenez for 75 minutes a game. On top of that, I have to say, it seems like he's actually getting back to his best football. That heel flick versus Man City was absolutely ludicrous. But it's really positive to see that he's getting consistent starts and actually just completely thriving and doing really well within these games. As the game weeks and the fixtures get a bit easier, Jimenez is probably just going to rise and rise in this cheat sheet. And that's that. With Welbeck, I was very adamant that I think he was still going to be a very strong pick. I think when you look at the Brighton fixtures, they look much better from an attacking perspective than compared to a defensive perspective. And that's why I don't necessarily rate, I suppose, Brighton offense versus defense equally within this period. And I think that's sort of what we've learned series and the video sort of looking at the projected goals versus the sort of projected clean sheets is a good illustration of how I compare, let's say, Brighton like attackers versus Brighton defenders. So something to think about there. I think Welbeck is still a very good pick because we don't really have an update conclusively on when João Pedro will come back, and I think he's very clearly first choice over Evan Ferguson. We've also seen him take penalties in the preseason. This was a comment that someone had raised last week. How am I sure that Welbeck is going to take penalties? Well, we've seen him take penalties in the preseason, and there's really no indication that he shouldn't be on penalties. So I think because there's a lack of clear penalty takers available at the club who are fit, then Welbeck is obviously going to be an amazing short-term pick, even though the fixtures aren't amazing. As far as Evan Nilsson, fixtures are getting tougher, but actually his minutes over the course of the season have gotten better and better. And that also means that in his competition with someone like Kluivert, who's probably going to take penalties or has a chance of taking penalties, that he's going to more than likely still be that penalty taker for Bournemouth. And I do think that he's still a valuable asset to hold if you own him at this present time. As far as Strand Larsen and Kedia, for me, Strand Larsen will definitely rise when the Wolves fixtures get better, but because he's not a penalty taker and I think he's more prone to being an early sub, he's still going to remain as a differential. And that same logic applies to Nketiah. As far as the Knicks tier, I know a lot of people are going to have some issues with Calvert-Lewin, right? He's not really produced anything either, outwardly or on underlying stats, and it's been a very dull season for Everton attack so far. But the fixtures are still really much there. I think you have to just look at, for example, Antonio versus Ipswich as a good example of when you give, let's say, forwards good fixtures, even though you might not rate them at this point in their career, at this point in their team, and how their team looks, it's actually still fine to value them highly just because of the price point, right? Calvert-Lewin is not someone who is at 7 million plus. He's arguably cheaper than some of the budget mids in the game that we can afford, and he compensates well or combines well in a structure where you're trying to save as much money as possible to get these big hitters in the game. So I still think Calvert-Lewin is high up there. If you think Wood is better, I think that's very clearly the case. I've said that before, but I think I did value the Calvert-Lewin fixture general run compared to Wood, and so far, of course, Wood has delivered with the goal versus Chelsea. So that's the tail of the tape. I still think they're both very, very good. With Solanke, amazing fixture swing here for Spurs that is really kicking into gear. With Jackson, it's the opposite situation where the fixtures are getting a little bit worse, and we know that his minutes are, as I said, not the same as Palmer's, so you can't really compare the two. And that's why Jackson, I feel, also has less permanence in a game like FPL, so that's why Jackson falls. As far as Watkins, fixture swing, once again, quite important. Not necessarily the penalty taker in my mind, quite important as well. So that's why Watkins gets a drop. His minutes have been really good so far. It's not like Duran's really competed with his minutes at all. And probably the one question mark a lot of people have is, what about someone like Cunha? Does he deserve a rise? I think Cunha will get a rise as well when the fixtures get a bit better for Wolves. And this also applies to Ait Nouri, who I'm sure a lot of people are excited to see in the cheat sheet next. But that's just a discussion point here in terms of when I'm making these movements. I'm cognizant that obviously in the future, we want to have players like Cunha, that we want to have players like Ait Nouri, but it's just not now necessarily. when they have Man City next. As far as Haaland, still at the top tier. I think, as I said, based on the captaincy swings in the foreseeable future, he's probably the preferred captain for me. So that's why Haaland definitely still is at the absolute top. As far as defense, switching over to that, I don't think there are too many changes on defense. Vandenberg still gets a lot of minutes. Greaves is still under a really good fixture swing, so they're great for the 4.0s. Milenkovic does get a rise because Nottingham Forest have continued to be extremely impressive so far. So I think Aina and Milenkovic are definitely great picks to consider. Pinnock, Van de Ven, Davis, Lewis, these are all players from teams who actually have good fixtures in the interim, right? Van de Ven just has a clean run of 4 or 5 games in a row. Pinnock still has, or is still in the midst of, a really good Brentford run, even though the defense, as I've mentioned, has slipped a little bit. Leif Davis is an extremely attacking defender. So when we compare it to the likes of, James Justin, who's been getting hauls lately, Ait Nouri as well, I think that generally speaking, he is very comparable to those players. And that's why I think Leif Davis, with the fixture swing being so good, is an amazing pick. And you can see that with the sort of underlying stats, right? He's still a level above any of the other players within this position, with exception to Ait Nouri, who's been incredible in open play, it has to be said. And that's also why I've added Ait Nouri to the cheat sheet. He's been unspeakably good. Definitely, of course, scoring, I suppose, in the odd games where you think Wolves will definitely struggle more. I'd be keen to see what the valuation of Ait Nouri is when the fixtures get a little bit better. But that's that. Right now, I think Colwell also gets a drop. The Chelsea fixture swing is getting much, much worse. Mikolenko gets a drop as well. Unfortunately, it seems like he's still struggling with sort of injuries and so on and so forth. With Justin, we also have him added to the cheat sheet, but I do think that he's clearly been a player who's been overperforming a lot. Now, Ait Nouri has also been overperforming a lot, but its underlying stats are also a lot better. So it kind of suggests that, generally speaking, he's getting into much more positive positions to actually get better hauls. And when Ait Nouri's fixtures get better, I mean, I can only see that sort of matching itself, or at least improving. With James Justin, even though fixtures are really good, I think let's not get it twisted in the sense that he's an extremely sort of high volume producing attacker just yet. He's obviously been performing really well, but I'm just saying, is there a basis necessarily from a data perspective to say that he's going to continue to get maybe 1 goal, 1 assist every match? I would say definitely not. As far as Quansah, he gets a drop with the Aston Villa fixture swing getting worse. Same with Dunk to an extent, because once again, a Van Heckless world isn't great. It seems like Van Heck might come back very soon, which is obviously a positive for Dunk. So that's something to stay tuned towards. Calafiori, Akanji, Saliba, and Robertson all drop. These are all players from higher tiers. Calafiori just simply due to the fixture swing moving away. With White coming back, I do think there's going to be an element of him and Timber's minutes being a little bit more up and down, and they could switch as well with the Champions League and rotation, because Timber is clearly also someone who needs to be rotated. And I think Calafiori in the short term is going to get a huge influx of minutes, as he has already. With Akanji, we did see actually less minutes from him in the previous week, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. As I said, I've always rated Akanji's minutes really highly, but of course he's also been playing way too many minutes of football, so it made sense when Walker came on for him in the previous match. But on top of that too, the Man City defense has been looking a lot more lackluster. So the reason why I hold Guardiola and Lewis so highly is because not only is the actual fixture run good for Man City, but generally speaking, they're also very prone to actually being a part of the City attack. So that's why I still think that Guardiola and Lewis are the absolute kings in this tier. As far as, let's say, Saliba, once again, it kind of goes back to the Arsenal fixture swing being worse. Arguably, he's also probably the worst Arsenal defender when it comes to prospective returns, because he's the least attacking out of them. And we also know that this season, the sort of bonus changes haven't really helped someone like Saliba in specific. On top of that, Robertson gets a drop because of that surprise benching for Tsimikas. And that's obviously a new sign, a new piece of information that we have to react to. That's going to have a huge dent in Robertson's future outlook if Tsimikas is going to take more minutes going forwards, as Liverpool head into a extremely busy fixture swing, which includes a lot of Champions League Cups matches. As far as the goalkeepers move on to that, Sells gets a rise. I think Nottingham Forest just have to be sort of credited with how good they've been on defense. Kelleher is also a new addition to the cheat sheet. It seems like he will be playing instead of Allison for quite a long while, at least up until that sort of November international break. And that's actually a rather considerable run of games. Would I really consider Kelleher as a transfer unless I had a huge bank of transfers? No. Or if I had a wild card, would I consider him? I probably would, actually. And that's simply because of Liverpool being so good. I think access towards a Liverpool defender, as we've seen with Konate this season, as we've seen with the amount of clean sheets that effectively any of the defenders who've actually played minutes for Liverpool have gotten, they're an extremely great defense. And the price point of Kelleher is still very, very, very obscene for the short term. As far as Flecken, he also gets a drop. As I said, Brentford, the trend so far has been that their defense have gotten worse, whilst the attack has gotten worse, or better rather, whilst the rest of the league has sort of moved in the opposite direction towards Brentford. So that's why Flecken drops. The other goalkeepers, I'm really not too fussed about them. I think there's a lot of fixture swings here that aren't too important. Would I really sort of prioritize anyone who's expensive other than Raya? Probably not, if I'm being completely honest. And that's why we have the only change, which is Ederson also dropping and Alisson being removed. Because, of course, Man City defense have looked really poor. You're not really looking at Ederson for anything else other than hopefully clean sheets or the occasional game where he has to make a lot of saves, which is very unlikely, right? For example, look at the amount of chances that Fulham had. He still ultimately only pulled out two saves and they still conceded 2 goals. So that's sort of the tail of the tape. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hope you guys have a lovely game week and have enjoyed the international break so far, but are ready to come back to some Premier League football. Take care and goodbye, and I'll see you guys soon.